Have you ever stopped to think about what can happen when fate crosses two completely different paths? What if, in the midst of cold, hunger, and loneliness, a simple attempt to get a piece of bread turned into the beginning of something unimaginable? Sofia, an orphan girl of only 9 years old, never imagined that when she entered that bakery in search of some food, she would be received with contempt, humiliation, and pushed out as if she were invisible. But sometimes, it is precisely in these moments of pain that something surprising happens. Have you ever been in a situation where it seemed like the whole world was turning its back? So stay here with me, because what happened soon after with this girl on the street will move you deeply. Take advantage and leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any story like this. Now, pay close attention. The cold, morning wind cut through the skin like small needles, while the first rays of sunlight tried in vain to warm the damp streets of the city. In the midst of the hurried rush of well-dressed and indifferent people, a small figure walked alone, barefoot, with her feet swollen and red from direct contact with the icy asphalt. His steps were short, almost hesitant, as if with each meter he fought against his own tired body. Sofia, only 9 years old, carried in her eyes something that few could sustain for long, a mixture of insistent hope and bitter resignation. Her disheveled hair swayed in the wind, and her thin, already threadbare blouse could barely protect her. His every breath formed small clouds of vapor, denouncing the brutal contrast between the fragility of that child and the relentless harshness of the morning. But what moved her was not only the cold. It was hunger. Not that occasional hunger of those who forgot to have lunch. It was the persistent, acute hunger that twists the stomach, burns the chest, and makes the body tremble. There were days since I saw a real meal, crumbs, scraps found in dumpsters, and, when luck permitted, some small piece of almost spoiled fruit made up what she called food. As she walked, the unmistakable smell of freshly baked bread made her stop abruptly. The warm and welcoming aroma escaped through the cracks in the bakery's door and enveloped the surrounding air as if to provoke her. His eyes widened before the impeccable window. Golden, crunchy breads, neatly stacked like little mountains of edible gold. Bright croissants, sweetbreads dusted with sugar, and baguettes still smoking. Everything looked even more beautiful under the soft light of dawn. She stood there for long seconds, almost hypnotized. His hands, curled up inside, the sleeves of his thin blouse trembled discreetly. Her eyes, slightly teary, reflected not only the desire for food, but also the silent pain of those who carry the weight of abandonment from a very early age. All around, adults went about their hurried routines, bought their coffees, their bags of bread, their slices of pie. No one noticed her, or if they noticed, they pretended not to see. Urban indifference, cold as the wind of that morning, was in charge of keeping her invisible. For a few moments, Sofia considered retreating. She felt intimidated, even ashamed. But something inside her pulsed more strongly. Maybe it was the survival instinct. Maybe it was just desperation. Gathering what little courage he had left, he took a deep breath and pushed the door of the bakery open. The bell above the entrance clinked softly, announcing his presence. For a brief moment, all eyes turned to this little intruder. Smartly dressed customers frowned, the clerk stopped serving their coffee, and the comfortable atmosphere of the bakery seemed to freeze. With shy steps, she approached the counter, his head bowed, his eyes fixed on the exposed bread, and his voice, almost like a whisper, broke the uncomfortable silence. He asked only for a piece of bread, nothing more. He didn't demand, he didn't beg. He just asked. On the other side of the counter, Mr. Avila, owner of the bakery, looked up and stared at her with a mixture of irritation and contempt. He was a rigid man, with a hard countenance, accustomed to seeing situations like that, not with eyes of compassion, but with the coldness of someone who judges quickly. For him, children like Sofia were a nuisance, a risk to the image of your establishment, a reflection of misery that he preferred to keep away from his impeccable showcase. Without thinking too much, with his face red with irritation, he raised his voice abruptly. His words cut through the air of the bakery like a blade. He called her a slut, said he didn't want beggars dirtying his business, and ordered her to leave in front of everyone. Some customers, uncomfortable, looked away. Others whispered, but no one intervened. Sofia tried to explain, but the words died in her throat, drowned by fear and shame. Before she could react, the man stepped forward and, with an impatient push, threw her out of the bakery. His frail body tripped over the threshold and fell to the cold, damp sidewalk. His palms scraped the ground, tearing out small drops of blood, while tears began to flow, mixing with the dirt of the street. People passed by, some even slowed down, for a moment, catching a glimpse of that uncomfortable scene, but soon after they continued on their way as if nothing had happened. Sofia sat on the sidewalk for a few minutes, breathing irregularly, trying to contain the sobbing and despair that invaded her. The humiliation burned more than the cold, and the emptiness in her stomach seemed even more cruel after that. The sky was beginning to clear a little more, but for Sofia, that dawn seemed to only prolong her anguish. She knew she needed to get up, but for a few seconds she couldn't find the strength. Her little body trembled, not only from the cold but also from the impact of the fall and the emotional pain that consumed her. At that moment, even surrounded by the hurried crowd of the city, she was completely alone. But as she kept her face down, trying to hide her tears, something began to subtly change in that scenario. Without her noticing it immediately, a watchful eye had captured every detail of that humiliating scene, a look different from all the others who simply ignored her. A gaze that, in the next few moments, would begin a sequence of events capable of transforming not only Sofia's destiny, but also that of many others who, like her, had been invisible for so long. Now tell me in the comments which city you are watching this exciting story. And of course, leave your like and subscribe to the channel to follow the next parts. The black car glided slowly down the busy avenue, almost as if it were driven not only by the driver, but by an invisible, silent, insistent force. The streets, enveloped by the cold brightness of the morning, seemed to witness another ordinary day of people in a hurry, appointments made and looks that avoided encountering the suffering of others. Inside the vehicle, Dona Helena watched the city through the window, her serene face hiding the turmoil that, for years, had inhabited her heart. Widowed for some time, she kept her life filled with social commitments, charity dinners, and occasional visits to cultural events. But despite the appearance of control, he carried within him a void that time could never completely fill. As the car drove slowly, his watchful eyes wandered absent-mindedly along the sidewalks. Nothing surprised her more in that large, indifferent city, until something sudden and unexpected captured her attention with an almost magnetic force. It was impossible to ignore. On the damp sidewalk, slumped, with her hands grated and her face marked by tears, was a girl with a fragile appearance and a lost look. It was a common scene for many. Another street child, some would think. Another social problem, others would say. But for Dona Helena, it was not just that. There was something about that child that made her momentarily lose her breath. His eyes narrowed as his heart subtly accelerated. It wasn't just the visible pain or the state of abandonment that impacted her. There was one particular detail, barely noticeable to anyone but glaring to her: the delicate shape of her eyes, the small dimple that appeared discreetly on her left cheek, and the soft contour of her face. They were traces that carried echoes of a painful past that she had never been able to forget. Old images began to blend into that scene before his eyes, as if time was superimposing layers of his own history on the raw reality of the street. For a few seconds, she stood still, almost hypnotized, as if the world around her had stopped. The memory of her deceased sister came with force. Those traits were the same. It was impossible for it to be a simple coincidence. Dona Helena's stomach tightened, and a restlessness took over her whole body. Without thinking twice, he ordered the driver to stop the car right there in the middle of the road, disregarding the impatient traffic that was beginning to form behind. He quickly descended, with firm steps, and headed towards the little girl, lying on the sidewalk. As he approached, he observed even more carefully every detail of that child. The dirty face, the teary eyes, the tangled hair. But still, behind all the misery, there was an innocent and pure beauty, like a flower insisting on blooming in the cracked asphalt. The girl tried to hold back her tears, shrugging her shoulders, as if she wanted to disappear, as if the world was crushing her with its indifference. With each step, Dona Helena felt the weight of a possible revelation approaching along with her. The heart was beating strongly, the air seemed denser, and the feeling that this moment would change everything became more and more real. When she finally got close enough, she crouched slowly, avoiding any sudden gesture that could scare the little girl even more. Helena's serious countenance softened into a calm, almost motherly smile as her eyes tried to meet the girl's. Sofia, still confused and suspicious, raised her face with difficulty. Her eyes, large and bright, even through tears, met the welcoming gaze of the stranger. For an instant, it was as if the two shared a silence full of something inexplicable. Dona Helena felt the impulse to extend her hand, but she restrained herself. First, I needed to understand what was behind that situation. Her heart told her that this girl was not just another street child. There was something there, something that could perhaps explain years of unanswered questions, sleepless nights, and a void that was never filled, no matter how hard he tried to fill his days with social commitments and solitary trips. Helena's presence began to attract the eyes of curious people around, but she didn't care. She was completely focused on that little figure before her. The driver, a little further away, watched attentively, ready to intervene if necessary, but respecting the space and instinct of his mistress, who seemed to be taken by something greater than simple compassion. It was not charity that he felt, nor pity. It was a strange, deep connection, as if invisible threads had been connecting those two lives since long before that meeting. While the girl shook her head in denial, trying to hide her tears and fear, Dona Helena felt the need to act. Not as someone who gives a coin and goes on his way. Not as someone who offers alms to ease his conscience. She knew she needed to do something more. There were questions to be answered, stories to be unearthed, and a thread of hope that could, perhaps, finally make sense of everything he had experienced so far. Without hesitation, he decided to take her with him. Not on impulse, but by a certainty that grew every second in his chest. I knew that that decision could completely change the trajectory of both. The driver approached, opened the rear door of the car, and carefully, Dona Helena led the girl into the vehicle. Sofia, still confused and frightened, allowed herself to be led. Her small eyes watched every detail of that luxurious car, as if she were entering another world, a world she had never imagined existed for someone like her. The journey to Dona Helena's residence was silent. As the car glided through the busy streets, Sofia remained huddled in a corner of the back seat, watching everything around her with a mixture of fear and fascination. Dona Helena, in turn, kept her gaze fixed on the girl, analyzing every detail, trying to organize her thoughts and control the avalanche of feelings that invaded her. I didn't want to press her with questions at that moment. I knew that the right time to understand the whole story would still come. When they arrived at the large house, the iron gate opened slowly, revealing a well-kept garden and an imposing, but welcoming building. It was an almost unreal contrast for someone who, minutes before, had been pushed and humiliated on the dirty sidewalk of the city. The driver parked the car at the main entrance, and with a delicate gesture, Dona Helena invited Sofia to enter. The girl hesitated for a few moments, her eyes roaming the room with a certain incredulity, as if she doesn't know if she can trust or if she is living a fragile dream that could collapse at any moment. Inside the house, the cozy warmth and the soft smell of fresh flowers enveloped her immediately. The delicate hands of one of the maids approached to help her with her thin and wet coat. Sofia, still suspicious, kept her eye attentive to every movement. Dona Helena instructed them to prepare a hot bath and a meal for the girl. Meanwhile, he remained watching from a distance, trying to mentally organize the pieces of that puzzle that was finally beginning to be assembled. With each gesture, with each expression, the feeling of familiarity increased. Dona Helena could not ignore the striking resemblance to her deceased sister. It was not only the physique, but also the sweet but firm way in which Sofia observed everything around her. It was as if she saw in her the reflection of her sister's youth, tragically lost years ago in circumstances that still tormented her today. While Sofia took a shower, With the hot water running over her skin, marked by dirt and accumulated cold, Dona Helena slowly climbed the stairs to her room. He opened an old box of memorabilia, carefully stored inside the closet. There were old photos of his sister, letters yellowed by time, small childhood objects. He took one of the photographs and looked closely at his sister's young, smiling face with the same dimple on her left cheek, the same expressive eyes. The pieces were finally beginning to fall into place. Hot steam filled the small bathroom as the water flowed down in continuous threads, washing away every trace of the dust accumulated in the days of abandonment. Sofia's pale skin was slowly regaining its true tone as the layers of dirt dissolved. Down the drain. The small hands, once hardened by the cold, now felt the heat slip, awakening sensations long forgotten. It was as if, in that simple and intimate moment, the body itself tried to remember what it was to be cared for. As the warm water flowed, the girl closed her eyes for short moments, allowing herself a rare comfort, although still shrouded in a cloud of uncertainty. On the upper floor of the house, Dona Helena remained leaning over the old box of memories. His hands, firm but trembling, removed one by one the memories that time had carefully piled up. There were photographs, small family jewels, yellowed letters, and a delicate bow of pink hair, so similar to the one that now adorned Sofia's clean hair, given over to a new beginning without yet knowing it. Each object brought up intense memories of his sister's youth, happy moments suffocated by a tragic end that was never fully understood. When his fingers touched a particular photograph, a shiver ran down his spine. The image showed her sister, still young, smiling, with her baby daughter in her arms. The child's gaze in the photograph seemed to cross time and fix itself on Helena's eyes with an almost supernatural force. The subtle dimple on the cheek, the delicate shape of the eyes, the soft contour of the face, everything about her screamed the same origin as Sofia. It was as if the face of the girl who now rested in her house was stamped on that old photograph, on a living duplicate of the child who had once mysteriously disappeared. Dona Helena's heart was racing, seized by a growing restlessness. For years, she had carried the silent pain of loss. Her sister, young and vulnerable, had become pregnant unexpectedly, estranged from her family in the face of social pressure and judgment. Shortly thereafter, he disappeared without a trace. There had never been a body. There had never been a goodbye. Only the cruel emptiness of unanswered questions. Now faced with this new possibility, what had previously seemed buried under layers of sadness and uncertainty began to emerge with unexpected force. Meanwhile, Sofia finished her shower and, wrapped in a soft towel, was gently led by the attentive hands of one of the employees to an airy and cozy room. The bed, large and fluffy, contrasted with the cold, hard floor that had so often been her only refuge. On a small table next to her, a plate of hot soup and slices of fresh bread awaited her. His eyes, still suspicious, scanned every detail with a mixture of fascination and caution. It all seemed too unreal for her to simply give in to relief. Each spoonful was accompanied by quick glances around, as if he feared that at any moment it would all be taken away from him again. Dona Helena watched from a distance, respecting the girl's space but keeping her attentive and meticulous eye. There was something there that went beyond the simple gesture of welcome. It was as if a part of herself was being rebuilt, piece by piece, as each new clue fell into place before her eyes. Sofia's face did not leave her mind. The features of the missing niece came to life again in that 9-year-old child, as if time had stopped to sow the destinies of the two in an unexpected and intense way. During the night, while Sofia fell fast asleep, exhausted not only by physical fatigue, but by the emotional turmoil of that unusual day, Dona Helena remained seated in her office, lost in thought. His sister's old letters rested on the table, words of hope, fear, and loneliness mingled in the delicate lines. There were mentions of unknown people, mysterious encounters, and desperate attempts to find a safe haven for her daughter. Confusing passages suggested that his sister had been involved with dangerous people, perhaps deceived by false promises of help in exchange for silence and submission. Each new discovery fueled Helena's restlessness even more. The hypothesis that Sofia could be his niece gained solid contours. It was no longer just an emotional impression, but a series of glaring coincidences that intertwined. The dates matched, the age was compatible, and the physical resemblance was undeniable. In the depths of his heart, something said that the truth was there, knocking on the door, waiting only for the courage to be dug up completely. The following days were filled with an atmosphere of quiet tension. While Sofia timidly began to get used to the comfort of that strange house, Dona Helena dedicated herself to digging through old documents, hospital records, and forgotten files in adoption institutions. Some doors closed in the face of his search. Others let slip small fragments of information that, although insufficient on their own, began to paint a grim picture of what could have happened years ago. There were records of illegal adoptions that occurred in that period, children who disappeared from official records without clear explanations, desperate families, young mothers deceived by proposals from unscrupulous people who promised safety in exchange for absolute silence. His sister's name appeared in some of these files, but always shrouded in gaps, as if someone had worked carefully to erase traces and confuse any future investigation. As she progressed in her search, Helena felt the shadow of a larger net behind it all. It was not just an isolated tragedy, but something more structured, an organized scheme that took advantage of the vulnerability of women in desperate situations. The more she delved into this tangle of information, the more her desire for justice grew, while the emotional bond with Sofia strengthened with each new day of coexistence. Sofia, even without fully understanding the complexity of that silent investigation, began to open up, albeit slowly, to the affection she received. His gestures became more natural, the smiles began to appear with less effort, and the sparkle in his eyes, although still shy, announced the rebirth of a hope that had seemed to have been dormant for a long time. The routine now included hot meals, bedtime stories, and soft conversations that gradually built a strong bond between the two. Dona Helena, in her solitary moments, observed every little gesture of the girl with a mixture of tenderness and anxiety. It was impossible not to notice how she held the spoon with the same way her sister held it as a child, or how she wrinkled her forehead when she tried to understand something new. They were small mirrors of the past, manifesting themselves in the present, bringing up emotions that were difficult to contain. Every day, the conviction that he had found his family grew like a firm seed, even without yet having the concrete evidence in his hands. During a rainy morning, while organizing some old documents owned by the family, Dona Helena found a sealed letter that she had never opened. It was a letter sent by her sister shortly before she disappeared. With trembling hands, he broke the aging seal and began to read the words written with the delicate and trembling handwriting of someone who carried the weight of desperate decisions. There, her sister reported her growing fear of the pressures she suffered, mentioned unknown people who promised her help in exchange for being away from her family, and spoke of the birth of her daughter, making clear her desire to protect her at any cost, even if it meant disappearing. The final words of the letter carried an unbearable weight. There was a confession that, if something happened to her, her daughter should be sought. It left vague clues, but with enough detail to indicate that the girl could have been handed over to third parties. The reading of the letter was like a dry blow to Helena's chest. Tears flowed silently as the last piece of that puzzle began to fit together with disturbing clarity. There, in the face of that new revelation, Dona Helena understood that fate had brought Sofia to her not by chance, but as a belated call to correct an old injustice, to restore ties that had been brutally broken, and to finally give this child the future that had been stolen from her from the cradle. The weight of these discoveries still echoed within her as the next decision, inevitable and necessary, began to take shape in her mind, pushing her towards the decisive steps that would need to be taken next. The first lights of the day had barely touched the windows of the house when Dona Helena, already awake, stared at the silence of her office with her mind immersed in a growing restlessness. The warmth of the recent revelation, that ancient letter that had unearthed memories and suspicions, burned in his chest like a call impossible to ignore. Sofia's resemblance to her lost niece was no longer a mere coincidence for her. Every detail of the girl seemed to scream the same story, that of a past that insisted on not being buried. But despite the pulsating intuition, Dona Helena knew that beyond emotions it was necessary to find the evidence, and so he began his search. She knew that she could not involve authorities or make public what, until that moment, was still a hypothesis. He could not run the risk of pushing the girl away, nor of alerting people who might have an interest in silencing the truth again. Everything had to be done cautiously, in the shadows, in absolute silence. Then, quietly, he traced a meticulous path of investigation, drawing on the few old contacts he still had, discreet people, old files, and dusty records. The first destination was the hospital where, according to official records, the niece had been born and supposedly died as a baby. When he arrived at the site, he found an old building with walls that carried the wear and tear of the years and neglect. In the countryside, new employees and few computerized files made it difficult to access information from decades ago. Even so, with his firm stance and an aura of quiet authority, he managed to open some doors and sift through old records. The yellowed pages of the record books contained faded handwriting, crossed-out names, incomplete notes. In the midst of disconnected dates, missing medical records and medical reports with generic descriptions, small disturbing gaps emerged. There were clear inconsistencies in the information at the time of the niece's birth. Conflicting dates, medical records of hospitalization with illegible signatures, and even stranger, the absence of a duly official death certificate. It was as if the child had disappeared from the system in a purposeful fog, carefully constructed, to erase its trace. As I left the hospital, I felt the latent confirmation that someone years ago had worked to hide the truth. However, the absence of a concrete document prevented her from taking the next step firmly. He needed more, and it was in foster homes and childcare institutions that he might find the missing links in this dark chain. On one of the visits to the city's old orphanage, now under new management and almost abandoned due to lack of resources, Dona Helena was received by a young director who knew little about the old scandals but allowed access to the old record books. Among fragile sheets and faded covers, Helena found pages full of notes made by hurried hands, with patches of paper and flawed ink. Once again, the records of the time were confusing and riddled with inconsistencies. Among so many papers, one particular entry caught his eye. There was mention of a child admitted to the orphanage, coincidentally on the same approximate date as the alleged death of his niece. The child's name didn't match, but the physical description fit eerily well. Once again, the dates matched, but the surname had been changed. A pattern began to emerge. Children registered with different names, changed medical records, and erased family history. A scheme of manipulation of administrative records became visible, a sinister mechanism that allowed the illegal movement of babies and children, turning fragile lives into commodities in the hands of unscrupulous people. As she gathered these fragments, Helena began to cross-reference the data with the news of an old scandal that had been hushed up over time. At the time, some complaints reached the local press, reporting a criminal group that exploited the desperation of young mothers, many of them in situations of social vulnerability, offering intermediation of unofficial adoptions, often without the consent of their own families. The articles, now hidden in the physical archives of old newspapers, painted an even darker picture. These were not isolated cases. It was an entire network operating under the connivance of a few public officials and health professionals, exchanging certificates, erasing records, and forging official histories. In one of these old reports, a name caught Helena's attention. It was an intermediary involved in the complaints, a man known for acting directly behind the scenes of these illegal negotiations. Although his public identity had been erased over time, some cross-references with documents from the orphanage and the hospital linked him directly to cases from the time his sister disappeared. Determined to deepen the investigation, Helena resorted to old contacts of her late husband, who maintained a certain influence among lawyers and former retired detectives. One of them, with privileged access to unofficial records, was able to locate financial documents and real estate records linked to this intermediary. What once seemed like just a name in a news story now came to life as a centerpiece in the web of corruption and child trafficking. Meanwhile, each night she returned home, Dona Helena found Sofia, now calmer, occupying herself with children's books, learning new words, trying to write short stories with her still trembling handwriting. There was a genuine sweetness in her eyes, a glimmer of hope that slowly rekindled, even though she did not understand the investigations that ran parallel to her new home. The days of abandonment began to be replaced by a routine of care, affection, and small daily discoveries. But inside Helena, the weight of responsibility grew. Each new clue reinforced the suspicion that Sofia had been a direct victim of that brutal scheme. The physical resemblance, the coinciding dates, the documentary inconsistencies, and now the connection with those involved in child trafficking formed a tangle of evidence that pointed to a single truth. The girl in front of her was, most likely, her sister's lost daughter. Even with so much information in hand, Dona Helena knew that it was still necessary to obtain irrefutable proof. An official document could be manipulated, a hospital record could be falsified, but blood does not lie. And it was along this path that she now began to turn her attention, knowing that soon she would need to make an even more delicate decision to finally confirm or not what her heart was already screaming so strongly. The sky that morning seemed to carry a different weight, as if the air itself was dense with the expectations that were formed inside Dona Helena's house. Every detail of the environment reflected the whirlwind that inhabited the woman's intimacy. The curtains slightly open, letting in the soft and filtered light, the polished wooden table with documents organized in small piles, and an almost respectful silence, as if the house knew the importance of what was about to happen. Dona Helena walked from one side to the other, restless, with her thoughts immersed in what would be the next and perhaps most decisive step in her search. For weeks, she had pieced together fragments of a dark past, dug into dusty records, combed through hospital archives and orphanages, connected the names of suspicious middlemen until finally she reached the point where the evidence became so overwhelming that her own heart could no longer deny it. But now, it was time to look for the only irrefutable proof, the one that no documentary manipulation could dispute: genetic confirmation. After all, blood carried truths that time, silence, and crime would never be able to erase. It was then that he turned to an old family friend, a trusted doctor who, over the years, had discreetly helped in delicate situations, and who was now fundamental for carrying out that exam. They talked with reserve and total discretion, aware of the need to keep each step confidential until everything was absolutely confirmed. Helena knew that the slightest leak of information could attract unwanted eyes and intentions, especially from people who, even so many years later, might still be interested in keeping certain truths hidden. With extreme care, and without Sofia realizing the weight of that gesture, Dona Helena managed to collect a small sample of the girl's hair. It was a simple, natural gesture during one of the morning care routines, while delicately combing her still damp hair after showering. Sofia, with her childlike innocence, did not even suspect that, in that small strand of hair carefully deposited, in an envelope, rested the key to the mystery that surrounded her origins since the first breath of life. The wait for the results was, for Dona Helena, an exhausting exercise in patience and emotional control. The days seemed to stretch beyond bearable, each hour dragging on as if time had decided to test the endurance of his hope. And while he waited, he watched Sofia with even more attentive eyes. She noticed small traces, almost imperceptible gestures, which echoed vivid memories of her sister's childhood in her memory. The way she frowned slightly when concentrated, the way she bit the corner of her lips when drawing, the slanted smile when she tried to disguise a mischievous thought. Every detail, even the most subtle, served as a kind of silent premonition of what the examination would come to confirm. When the envelope with the report finally reached his hands, his legs weakened for a moment. She took a deep breath before opening it, as if she needed to prepare her own body for the emotional impact she knew was coming. The letters printed on the paper left no room for doubt. The data were there, cold and mathematical, but loaded with a meaning that words could not fully describe. The examination pointed clearly. Sofia was, in fact, the daughter of her missing, her niece. She was her only living heir, the last direct link to the sister whose absence had corroded her for so many years. The tears came immediately, running freely down her previously restrained face. They were not only tears of relief but also of pain, of longing, of everything that could have been and was torn away in a brutal and cowardly way. Now, faced with the confirmation that his heart had already anticipated, he felt as if part of his own history was being returned piece by piece in the form of belated redemption. The girl who weeks ago was lying on the icy sidewalk, rejected and invisible to the eyes of the world, now had a name, an origin, a family that recognized her as their own. In the next room, Sofia played quietly with small wooden figures, concentrating on building scenarios with colored blocks. His eyes shone with that typical curiosity of childhood, oblivious to the emotional gale that unfolded a few meters away. When Dona Helena entered the room, tears still shone under her eyes, but the soft smile she carried on her face conveyed a welcoming tenderness that immediately caught the girl's attention. Sofia looked at that woman with a mixture of familiarity and comfort, as if even without understanding the complexities of that story, she already felt within herself the security of belonging to that place. It was a bond that, little by little, solidified in every gesture of care, in every word of affection, in every moment shared between the two. And now, with the confirmation in hand, Dona Helena knew that it was no longer a gesture of compassion. It was, rather, the legitimate reconstruction of a family broken by perverse forces that for so long controlled destinies with invisible hands. The following days passed under a new atmosphere. For Helena, the relief of the confirmation was accompanied by the weight of an even greater responsibility. It was no longer just the welcome of a child in need, but the definitive commitment to give Sofia what had always been denied her: a true home, a restored surname, the memory of her honorable mother, and above all, the chance to live with dignity, away from the gloomy shadow that marked the beginning of her existence. However, even with the certainty about Sofia's origin now crystal clear, a deeper uneasiness began to form within Helena. The DNA confirmation not only ended a cycle of personal searches, but also reopened a dangerous path that she knew she could not ignore. The truth about her sister's disappearance, the involvement of criminals in that illegal adoption scheme, and the hidden faces behind so many tragedies continued to lurk like open scars that still bleed discreetly in the memory of the city. If, on the one hand, there was the relief of having found his sister's only heir, on the other there remained the almost uncontrollable call for justice, because it was not enough just to protect Sofia from the past. It was necessary to face, head-on, those who built the horror in which so many children were swallowed. The network that disappeared with her niece and with many other victims was still alive in the memory of documents that were now beginning to be confronted, one by one, under the implacable determination of Dona Helena. As she watched Sofia fall, asleep that night, Helena's thoughts wandered through everything that still needed to be unearthed. The pieces were beginning to line up, and she knew that the next steps would take her even deeper into the bowels of truth, in ways that would require courage, intelligence, and above all, absolute discretion. The weeks that followed were calm only on the surface, like a lake that hides under its serene waters the strong currents of a turbulent past. Dona Helena, now in possession of the unquestionable confirmation of DNA, felt within herself the weight of truth, like a flame that would not go out. Every time she looked at Sofia, a mixture of relief and sadness accompanied her. Relief for finally having found her, sadness for the invisible scars that the girl carried, the result of years of abandonment, suffering and loneliness that should never have existed. With each dawn, Sofia was transformed before the attentive eyes of Dona Helena. His eyes, once suspicious and always on alert, now shone with the innocence that had been stolen from him in childhood. The smile became more frequent, the games looser, as if, finally, he could experience the childhood that life had denied him. Even without fully understanding the complexity of everything that had happened, the girl felt in the depths of her heart that for the first time she was safe. But what Sofia still didn't know was the cruel dimension of the story that brought her there. Dona Helena knew she couldn't keep that secret forever. To carry alone the burden of all that she had discovered would be unfair, even to Sophie, who had the right to know her true story, however painful it might be. And little by little she began to prepare for the moment of revealing the truth, looking for a way to conduct that conversation with the delicacy and care that the girl deserved. It wouldn't be easy. The right words always seemed to slip away when he tried to organize what he needed to say, but prolonged silence would be even more cruel. The truth, even loaded with pain, was necessary. On a serene evening, in the middle of the garden of the house where Sofia now used to play under the shade of the trees, Dona Helena finally found the strength to start revealing the past. With a heavy heart, he guided the girl gently to the wooden bench near the fountain, where the soft sound of the water seemed to cradle the weight of the words that were about to be spoken. Sofia, with the innocence of her few years, listened carefully to each piece of the story, trying little by little to fit those complex pieces into her childish mind. Dona Helena told about the girl's mother, the daughter of her own sister, a young woman who became pregnant very early in the midst of a difficult phase of life. The young woman, without support and surrounded by false promises, ended up being involved by unscrupulous people, members of an adoption trafficking network that took advantage of the vulnerability of desperate women. The gang operated coldly, deceiving mothers with promises of safety and good homes for their children, but actually profiting from the pain of others. Realizing the mistake and trying to escape from that scheme, Sofia's mother paid the highest price. She was brutally murdered to ensure the silence that would keep that criminal network running freely for years. With her mother out of the way, Sofia, still a baby, was torn from the little that remained of her origin and thrown into a cruel cycle of temporary homes where she suffered neglect, mistreatment, and hunger. It was an invisible cog in a corrupted system where helpless children were treated as commodities traded in the shadow of the law. What could have been a sheltered childhood turned into an endless sequence of closed doors, silent violence, and an existential emptiness that she herself still struggled to understand. While listening, Sofia kept her gaze fixed on Dona Helena, trying to process the weight of that story that, until that moment, was completely unknown to her. The lump in her throat tightened, but her eyes remained attentive, absorbing each word as if somehow her soul had already carried echoes of that pain, since long before it understood it rationally. It was not just a revelation of facts. It was the rescue of his lost identity, of a past that, even though terrible, finally gained contours and names. Dona Helena, even holding back her own tears, kept her voice firm. She knew that at that moment, the most important thing was to offer the girl the assurance that the horror belonged to the past. Now what was before Sofia was a new life, protected and surrounded by love, different from anything she had experienced until then. However, within her, the indignation against those who had built such cruelty turned into a force that propelled her even more. The following nights were silent. Sofia spent long periods staring at the ceiling, revisiting in her mind every little fragment of her story that began to reconfigure itself within her. Faces that previously had no names now took shape. The inexplicable absences became understandable within that macabre plot that his life had gone through. Even with the pain of these revelations, there was also a strange relief, that of finally understanding that her misery had not been her fault, nor a punishment or the result of chance. He had been the victim of a heinous crime committed by people who should never have touched anyone's life. While Sofia silently elaborated everything she had heard, Dona Helena dedicated herself to new movements, now with an even more defined purpose. The truth had emerged, but those responsible for this dark story remained untouched, and within her the desire for justice gained strength. The documents gathered, the clues already obtained, and the names that began to be repeated in the investigations now formed a trail that pointed directly to people who were still influential. Protected by decades of silence and corruption, every visit by Helena to old contacts, every document reviewed, every conversation whispered in discreet rooms, fed this construction of justice. The network of illegal adoptions that had destroyed her sister's life and nearly erased Sofia's existence, was about to be exposed. But for that, firm and careful steps would still be necessary, because the enemies who once profited from so much suffering continued to hide in the shadows, protecting themselves with the same weapons of manipulation and fear that they had always used. The chains of the past, however, no longer held the truth. Dona Helena was now walking with a clear objective. Sofia, even without yet understanding the totality of the next steps, was the reason and the strength of all that. The gears that had previously turned in favor of silence were finally beginning to creak under the weight of the truth that was preparing to surface. The wheels of truth, so long held back by unseen hands and vested interests, were finally beginning to turn with force. Each new document, each crossed name, each record recovered by Dona Helena made up a mosaic that is now clear and solid. What was once just suspicion and a fragment of memory now turned into a concrete line of investigation, capable of bringing down the criminal network that had destroyed so many lives, including that of her sister and Sofia's childhood. But the path for this truth to gain the weight of justice required more than paper proof. It required courage to expose those who, for years, hid under the veil of impunity. Among the pieces of that puzzle, one name stood out with uncomfortable frequency, that of Mr. Avila, the same owner of the bakery who one day, in front of indifferent looks, pushed Sofia to the cold street as if discarding something worthless. Until then, his participation in the illegal adoption network was nothing more than a shadow in the investigations, a name that emerged discreetly but constantly in records of donations, financial transactions, and clandestine meetings with already identified members of the gang. However, with the in-depth analysis of the information gathered, Dona Helena realized that Avila was not just a ruthless merchant who despised street children. He had been an essential cog in the machinery that allowed these children to simply disappear from the official records. Avila's role went beyond what anyone could have imagined. Not only did he provide logistical support, but he also facilitated the disappearance of documents, connected desperate mothers to intermediaries, and, in exchange for generous compensation, ensured that records disappeared without a trace. It was he who often served as a silent link between vulnerable young mothers and criminals who traded their children as if they were commodities. The revelation of his participation was one of the biggest shocks in the investigation conducted by Dona Helena and the authorities discreetly involved. The man who, in a cruel gesture, had humiliated Sofia and thrown her into the street in front of everyone, did not do so only out of contempt or social arrogance. He knew exactly who she was. He knew the origin of that girl, and, even more, he feared the risk that her presence represented. The mere appearance of Sofia in that bakery that day had been a stroke of luck and terror for Avila. Lucky because he had the chance to push her away before they would publicly recognize her. Terror because her presence meant that the ghosts of her past were knocking on her door. Now, with all the evidence gathered and the official support of the authorities, the time has come to break the silence definitively. Dona Helena organized, with the help of investigators, a careful operation so that the confrontation with Avila would no longer take place behind the scenes, but in plain sight. The choice of location could not be more symbolic. The very bakery where the girl had been humiliated months earlier, the exact scene where the cycle of abuse had begun to crumble. On the appointed morning, the small establishment woke up surrounded by discreet plainclothes agents, ready to act as soon as the moment came. Journalists, previously warned that a bombshell complaint would be revealed, also occupied their strategic places, armed with cameras and microphones that would record every second of that awaited outcome. The room, which normally exuded the warm aroma of freshly baked breads and trivial conversations of regular customers, that morning carried an almost palpable tension. The arrival of Dona Helena and Sofia at the bakery brought an atmosphere of absolute silence. All eyes turned to them. The girl walked with firm steps, hand in hand with Helena, her face raised and her gaze assured, in absolute contrast to the fragile and frightened child who had been expelled from there months ago. It was impossible not to notice the strength contained in that image. The victim now returned to the scene of the aggression, no longer as someone invisible, but as a living symbol of a justice that was finally beginning to be restored. Avila, surprised by the movement, initially tried to maintain a semblance of normality, serving customers with forced smiles. But as agents and the press approached, his face began to lose its color. The siege was closed, there was nowhere else to run. When the evidence was presented, with the judicial authority making his arrest official, his mask fell off completely. Arrogance gave way to panic. Gestures became shaky and sweat ran down his pale forehead. No justification, no denial could erase the records, the financial documents, the testimonies collected, and above all, the irrefutable presence of Sofia, the child he helped erase from the records and threw on the streets as a nuisance. The cameras captured every detail. The metallic sound of handcuffs closing at his wrists was the soundtrack to that historic moment. Journalists competed for space to record the images. Microphones captured the official arrest orders, while the people who began to crowd the sidewalks watched with expressions of shock, indignation, and for many, relief. Finally, one of the faces behind so many child disappearances was publicly exposed. The man who for years had quietly profited from the desperation of vulnerable families was now led by the police, under the watchful eye of society that for so long had been deceived by his respectable facade. While Avila was escorted out of the bakery, Sofia remained firm, holding Dona Helena's hand even tighter. There was no need for words between them at that moment. The simple gesture of remaining side by side carried the strength of everything they had experienced, of the losses, of the humiliations, but above all, of the overcoming that now imposed itself firmly on everyone. Avila's arrest not only sealed his own downfall, but also paved the way for new investigations into the other members of that criminal network that for years operated in the shadows. The information gleaned from her financial records and contacts could finally completely dismantle the system that tore so many children from their homes, as Sofia had torn from her infant mother. For Dona Helena, that was not the end. It was the mark of a new chapter, a chapter where the truth would no longer be silenced, where each child forcibly taken from their families would finally have a face and a story revealed. And for Sofia, that moment meant the definitive rescue of her dignity, the public recognition that her life, previously thrown into the trash bin of indifference, now had value, name and history. Even under the incessant flashes of the cameras, as the chaos of the prison unfolded before the eyes of the city, inside the girl and Dona Helena, there was a new serenity, as if, finally, the shadows that surrounded them were beginning to dissipate, giving way to the light they had been struggling to see completely for so long. What was yet to come, however, would bring even more surprising developments. The repercussion of Avila's arrest was immediate and intense. The images broadcast by the news ran not only through the streets of that city, but spread like wildfire through newspapers, talk shows, and social networks. The scandal of the illegal adoption gang, for so long hidden under the cloak of corruption and fear, finally gained the light that had always been denied to it. Sofia's name came naturally as a symbol of this rebirth of truth, and the story of that girl, who had once been expelled as an unwanted burden on the sidewalk of a bakery, now touched the hearts of thousands of people around the country. Dona Helena, faced with the public commotion and the end of years of anguish, felt a new call within her. The pain that had accompanied her for so long, the loss of her sister, the emptiness that was left with the disappearance of her niece, and the suffering stamped on Sofia's trajectory now took on a new meaning. It was not enough just to have unmasked the criminals and welcomed the girl into his home. It was necessary to do something bigger, something that could, in fact, transform pain into an instrument of healing and reconstruction. For many others who, like Sofia, had their childhoods torn away without mercy, it was with this firm conviction that she began a project that was born from the bowels of her own history, the creation of a foundation dedicated to welcoming, protecting, and giving new opportunities to orphaned children and victims of exploitation. It would not be just a temporary shelter, but a true refuge where each child could rediscover their dignity, receive education, psychological support, and the chance to write a new story, free from the shackles of the traumatic past. The first weeks of operation of the foundation were intense. With the support of authorities touched by the scandal and ordinary people moved by the strength of Sofia's story, the resources began to arrive. Anonymous donations, partnerships with professionals from different areas, and a committed team were formed around that mission. The previously empty corridors of the old mansion, renovated by the foundation, were soon filled with children's voices, shy laughter and looks that gradually shone again, just as Sofia's had learned to do. Sofia, on the other hand, adapted with surprising lightness to her new routine. The girl who once walked barefoot through the streets, with the heavy gaze of someone who carried abandonment on her back, now stood with the confidence of someone who had finally found her place in the world. Each morning she was greeted with enthusiasm by the new discoveries, the reading classes, the first letters carefully drawn in the new notebooks, the illustrated books that now populated her small private library. The universe of knowledge, once so distant and unreachable, gradually became a daily companion, shaping the world-view of that girl with a sweet look and a resilient soul. But it was not only in learning that Sofia flourished. Human relationships, which had previously caused him distrust and withdrawal, now opened up naturally. The other children who arrived at the foundation found in it a silent example of overcoming. She understood better than anyone each suspicious look, each hesitant embrace, each tear contained in the first days of adaptation of the new sheltered. And, with a sensitivity matured precociously, he knew exactly how to offer simple words and gestures that made all the difference. Soon, its history went beyond the walls of the foundation. Invited to interviews, reports, and awareness events, Sofia came to be recognized as a true symbol of hope. No longer the defenseless victim of a cruel system, but the living proof that it was possible to rebuild lives even after the deepest traumas. Her serene presence in front of the cameras, her firm gaze when telling her trajectory with simplicity, deeply touched everyone who listened to her. Anonymous people sent letters of support, donations increased, and entire families sought the foundation to collaborate in some way. For Dona Helena, seeing Sofia grow up in this role was something that mixed pride and unconditional love. Alongside the girl, she participated in every detail of the foundation's administration, supervised the hiring of educators, psychologists, and social workers, followed the evolution of the children, and, above all, remained attentive to ensure that each little being welcomed there received not only assistance, but true affection and human welcome, elements that she knew were the most precious to heal such deep wounds. Over time, the foundation expanded its activities. Family rehabilitation programs, campaigns against child trafficking, and partnerships with local schools have been established. Sofia's name became a reference not only for the public, but also for professionals in the field of social assistance, who saw in her the concrete representation of how the right care offered at the right time can transform destinies that previously seemed condemned to perpetual pain. Even in the moments when the spotlight diminished and the routine returned to its usual tranquility, the essence of that place remained firm. Each child who entered the gates of the foundation carried with them a difficult history, but also an immense potential for rebirth. And in each of these children, Sofia saw a little of herself. This identification made her walk among them with an impressive naturalness, being heard and respected not by imposition, but by genuine connection with her pains and dreams. In parallel, Dona Helena kept alive the search for full justice. Other investigations were unfolded from the original scandal, and little by little new arrests were made. Names once protected by influence and money began to fall. What had seemed untouchable for so long now crumbled under the weight of public exposure and irrefutable evidence gathered during years of enforced silence. Each unmasked face was, for Helena and Sofia, another fragment of the historical debt finally being paid. The cycle that had begun with the humiliation of a starving girl expelled from a bakery now turned into a chain of reconstruction and hope. What was once the symbol of society's indifference was now an example of how love, persistence, and justice could write a new chapter even on the rubble of so much suffering. but as the flowers of the reconstruction bloomed day after day inside. The foundation, a still inconspicuous shadow, hovered in a quiet corner of history. Among the files investigated, there were indications that not all those involved had been identified. People with greater power, responsible for protecting and financing that network from the roots, remained hidden. Helena knew that the path was not yet fully traveled. There were more layers beneath that cruel past, and sooner or later they would come to light, revealing even darker secrets that had been hiding for years in the cracks of impunity. The years have followed their course with the delicacy of those who, little by little, recompose what was once broken. The foundation, which had been born from mourning, transformed into purpose, flourished like a garden of hope in the midst of what had once been an arid terrain of suffering and abandonment. Dona Helena, with her serene and firm presence, went ahead of everything, now with the company of a grown-up, transformed Sofia, whose story inspired not only the children welcomed, but an entire community that had learned to see, in that girl's pain, the reflection of so many other invisible existences. Sofia, who had previously walked with her head down, frightened by the cold corners of the city, now walked the corridors of the foundation with sure steps, bright eyes, and a serenity that overflowed with maturity. The suffering she had carried in childhood no longer defined her. On the contrary, it had been the seed of his strength, and this strength, visible in every gesture of affection with the newly arrived children, in every encouraging word to the new ones welcomed, in every decision made with youthful wisdom, had become a reference inside and outside the institution. The walls of the foundation, once marked by the silence and pain of those who arrived there, now vibrated with the sound of lively conversations, laughter, small children's discussions, and the constant coming and going of projects that came to life daily. Art workshops, music, tutoring, integration programs with schools in the city, each activity designed with the care of those who understand, in essence, what it means to rebuild an interrupted childhood. And Sofia, with her captivating presence, became the beating heart of this work, even without realizing the size of the impact she had on everyone around. But the recognition for this trajectory was not limited to the walls of the foundation. Over time, the work developed by Dona Helena and Sofia began to be noticed by authorities, international organizations, and the press. The name of the foundation, previously known only locally, was now gaining space in conferences, reports, and awards. The story of the orphan girl who was rejected in a bakery, rescued by a stranger, and transformed into a symbol of overcoming, moved audiences and inspired public policies aimed at protecting children in vulnerable situations. It was in this context that the grand opening of a new shelter was organized, the result of the expansion of the foundation in partnership with public agencies and social investors who saw in the cause a path of true social transformation. The event would bring together political representatives, social assistance professionals, educators, journalists, and above all, children and adolescents who, like Sofia, had found there the starting point for their lives. The morning of the inauguration dawned with clear skies, as if time itself wanted to celebrate the milestone of that day. Flags fluttered softly in the breeze, while dozens of chairs were arranged in the new building's expansive courtyard, carefully decorated with flowers and drawings made by the foundation's own children. The stage, simple, awaited the solemn moment, when the words would give shape to what those years had represented for so many. When Sofia took the stage, accompanied by a brief, respectful applause, there was in her eyes the calm of someone who learned early the meaning of resistance. She was no longer the fragile girl who had once been supported in Dona Helena's arms, but a young woman with a firm presence, with the elegant posture of someone who carries scars transformed into strength. He took a deep breath and, for a moment, his eyes wandered over the audience, finding familiar faces of educators, children smiling shyly, authorities with attentive faces, and volunteers who, over the years, had become family. As he began to speak, his voice sounded clear and sure. The first words did not narrate victories nor exalt numbers, nor list the achievements of the foundation. She opted for something much more intimate. He told how it all began. He shared, with the same honesty of someone who speaks in the ear of a close friend, The day he entered that bakery with an empty stomach and a heart full of hope. She recalled, with details that still remained vivid in her memory today, the push that threw her to the icy ground of the sidewalk and the indifferent look of those who saw her as a nuisance to be discarded. As his words filled the space, the silence of the audience became thicker and thicker. There was a solemn respect in the air, mixed with the growing emotion of all present. Many could not hold back their tears, touched not only by the harshness of what they heard, but by the strength with which Sofia narrated her own story without revolt, without rancor, but with the dignity of someone who transformed trauma into a life mission. She talked about the moment when an unknown woman stopped her car on that same street, approached her with a look different from all the others, and held out a hand that would change her story forever. She said that from that gesture, she found a home, a new mother, and an opportunity to see the world from a perspective she never imagined would be possible. At the end of the story, when he paused for a brief second, his eyes wandered again through the audience, now full of emotional faces. There were children who shared the same past, volunteers who had accompanied their journey from the beginning, and young adults who, years ago, had also been rescued by the Foundation and who were now returning to celebrate that new stage of the collective history that everyone helped to build. The applause that followed his speech was neither explosive nor rehearsed, but charged with an almost palpable emotional weight. It was the silent recognition of a crowd that understood there the true meaning of overcoming. More than an inauguration speech, what everyone witnessed was the materialization of a journey that had begun under the weight of rejection and now ended as a living symbol of resilience and transformation. While the clapping filled the air and the children timidly approached Sofia, seeking hugs and words of encouragement, Dona Helena watched from afar, with her chest warmed by a serene pride. All the effort, the sleepless nights, the silent investigations, the legal fights, the constant fear of enemies who tried to silence the truth, all of that now converged on that moment. But even as they celebrated that milestone, they both knew that there were still shadows behind that story. There were powerful figures whose names had not been fully revealed, whose hands for years had financed and protected that corrupt system. Justice had made great strides, but some doors remained closed, protected by hidden interests and alliances, built in the darkness of the backstage. And these doors sooner or later would also need to be opened. And so in that same place where it all began, the marks of the past now gave way to firm steps and looks full of peace. The sidewalk that once witnessed the pain and rejection of a lonely girl today kept the quiet steps of Sofia and Dona Helena, side by side as a silent reminder that even in the most difficult stories, fate knows how to draw new beginnings that no one could imagine. If this trajectory touched you in any way, leave it here in the comments. I believe in new beginnings. It will be beautiful to see how many people, like Sofia, carry this hope within themselves. Also take advantage and subscribe here to the channel, because I always bring stories that, like this one, show how much life can surprise when we least expect it. Oh, and leave your like, because that's how I know we're creating these moments of emotion and reflection together. There is a video here on the side that tells a similar and equally exciting story. Click and stay with me there.